Hello everyone, this is Professor Keen. This is a continuation of my previous lecture where I was discussing Chapter 1 of A Student's Guide Through the Great Physics Texts, Volume 2. This chapter is called Scaling in Art and Nature. And in this chapter we begun our discussion of Galileo's dialogues concerning two new sciences. The first of those new sciences is the consideration of the strength of materials. And this dialogue begins, as I mentioned there, with a discussion between Salviati, Segredo, and Simplicio about certain observations they were making. These observations regarded the fact that it seems that large objects seem to be more susceptible to fracture than small objects. So they had made a distinction between things tending to fracture as a result of an external force being applied to them, and things tending to fracture as a result of their own weight trying to break them. So if you have a beam sticking out of a wall and you apply a force to it to try to break it, an external force by, let's say, hanging a weight from it, then a larger beam will support a larger weight. But if, on the other hand, you're considering the weight of the beam itself, then a large beam will be more likely to break under its own weight than a small beam. And in the coming chapters, what Galileo is going to do is develop this idea and come up with some mathematical formulas that describe precisely how this effect works. But right now in this chapter, he's giving kind of an outline of where he's going to be going with these considerations. That brought us about up to page 6 in A Student's Guide. And at this point, Salviati begins to talk a bit about the procedure that they're going to be following in the rest of this section of text. And he says, and here's a quote from him, "Let us proceed by demonstration." So this is as opposed to by proceeding by probabilities in order to prove what he's saying. So in other words, how he's going to proceed is say, let's start with some basic axioms that we can all agree on, and then we'll proceed deductively by deductive reasoning what we can derive from these axioms. This is the opposite of proceeding inductively or using probabilistic reasoning. So the example I like to give is inductive reasoning is what is most often used in the sciences today. It consists of looking at nature and then by enough observations of nature coming up with a general law that seems to capture the most common occurrences. So for example, and I think I've used this example before, if I look out the window and I see a red bird, and I look out the window again and see a red bird, and I look out the window again and see a red bird, after those three observations, I come up with a general law that all birds are red. Now, this is not deductive reasoning. This is called inductive reasoning. I'm starting from observations and concluding with some kind of law that seems to capture nature. Of course, this can be falsified. If I look out the window the next day and see a blackbird, then my law that all birds are red must be false. So there's nothing necessarily true about inductive reasoning. This is the kind of reasoning that scientists are very commonly use nowadays. It's kind of a probabilistic or inductive approach to science. Galileo uses that approach sometimes, but he also uses deductive reasoning. He says, let me see if we start with certain axioms or beginning points that we can all agree on, what can we deduce from this, or what can we demonstrate based on this? And this is how fields like geometry proceed. We start with certain axioms and then see what logically follows from those axioms. This is just sort of a broader issue that I think is very interesting because Galileo historically was working at a time when scholasticism was he was fighting against scholasticism, which was the kind of technique that a lot of the medieval thinkers were using, and a lot of scholastic reasoning proceeded deductively by demonstrating things. And what you're seeing here is kind of a shift. Galileo is still using deductive reasoning, but we're going to see a shift away from deductive reasoning and toward inductive reasoning, with specifically scientists like Pascal, who is more comfortable with probabilistic reasoning. In fact, Pascal, his arguments for why you should believe in God, or at least one of them, the most famous one, Pascal's wager, is explicitly a probabilistic kind of argument for the existence of God. that is or for the belief in God. That's a very different kind of approach than what many of the scholastics did when they were arguing for the existence of God. They proceeded by demonstration from first principles. Anyway, maybe we'll have a chance to come back to that later on, but I thought I'd make that comment right here. Okay, so now what Galileo is going to do is he's going to start talking about understanding the strengths of materials. So he says in order to understand the strengths of materials, we have to understand first that they have internal cohesion. This is the basic starting point from which he's going to be deducing some of his results. And he uses the example of a suspended stone pillar. So if you have a stone pillar, this is one of the figures in the text. If you have a stone pillar suspended from a ceiling, and you want to break it, let's say by hanging a weight from the bottom of the stone pillar, there's going to be some weight that you hang from it such that the stone pillar will shatter, or it will break apart. So there's sort of this, you imagine the stone pillar hanging down, and I hang a weight from it, and beyond a certain weight, it's going to break that stone pillar. What prevents it from breaking is the internal cohesion of whatever it is that's holding that stone together. So that cohesion is able to support a certain amount of weight, but if you hang enough weight, that cohesion will be overcome by the weight. So the weight will break it if it's sufficient. A second example of the cohesion or internal cohesion of a substance, he refers to a hemp rope. So a rope, when you hang a rope from a ceiling, you can hang weights from it and it will support those weights. Of course, if you hang enough weight, you can snap the rope. What they then do is Segredo, Simplicio, and Salviati go off on a short digression, and they're a bit perplexed. I think it's Salviati who's perplexed by the fact that a hemp rope, or any other kind of rope for that matter, can be made that's 100 feet long, even though the individual fibers of the rope are perhaps only 2 or 3 feet long. So how is it that despite the fact that each fiber is only 2 or 3 feet long, you weave this rope out of these short fibers, make a 100-foot long rope, and this rope can withstand enormous forces before snapping? Why is it hard to break this rope? Well, the answer that Galileo provides is that the twisting of the rope is what binds the fibers together, binds these filaments together, and makes it difficult for them to slip past one another. So the binding of the fibers, the twisting of them, makes it so that they press against each other, and then when you try to pull them apart, the frictional force between the individual fibers prevents them from sliding past one another. As an example to maybe demonstrate how to think about this, if you take your hand and you press it downward against the top of a table, and then you try to slide it across the table while you're pushing down, you're going to find that it's somewhat hard to slide. The force with which you push down on the table, by the way, that would be called a normal force. We'll come back to that later on, but it's normal or perpendicular to the surface. It's a downward force. And the force that resists your hand sliding across the table, that's called the frictional force. And the point I'm making here is that the frictional force that's preventing your hand from sliding is related to the normal force. In other words, if you push harder against the table, the normal force gets larger and the frictional force also gets larger. And in fact, these are proportional to one another. So if you double the normal force, you in fact double the frictional force. And so the idea that's being brought up here, why am I bringing this up? Because when you twist these fibers together, there's a normal force pushing the fibers against each other, and that is creating the frictional force so that it's hard for them to slide past each other. By the way, this is also the reason why, for instance, a sailor or a shipman wraps a rope around, I don't remember what they're called, the rod on the ship that makes it slide, and it's hard for the anchor to drop when it's wrapped around that rope. And this is also why, like a cowboy, for example, when they lasso a horse, they wrap the rope around the saddle horn, and the normal force pushing on the rope from the saddle horn creates friction that makes it harder for the rope to slide around the saddle horn. So this is a topic that Salviati and Segredo and Simplicio talk a bit about as the result, as an example of a force that causes cohesion between substances. One of the points they're making here also is that since a concrete or a marble pillar does not have this fibrous structure, it seems that these kind of frictional forces are not going to be able to explain the cohesion of this marble pillar, why it's hard to break a marble pillar apart, even if they can explain, for instance, why a rope is able to be to cohere to itself. Okay, so in the next lecture, which will go on to chapter 2 of A Student's Guide to the Great Physics Texts, we're going to go a little bit deeper into this topic of cohesion. And specifically, Galileo is going to try to understand the strength of this cohesive force and come up with some theories for why objects cohere.